The wind howled across the barren plains, carrying with it the scent of dust, sweat, and the faint echo of sorrow. The small frontier town of Dry Creek had seen its fair share of hardship, but nothing prepared it for the moment a desperate cry shattered the silence. "Please, don't take my child away," the widow's voice rang out, sharp with despair, a mother's plea torn from the very depths of her soul. Every man, woman, and drifter within earshot froze. Some looked away, some whispered, and some sneered at her helplessness. But one figure, leaning against the weather-beaten post of the saloon, lifted his head. His eyes, hidden beneath the brim of a dusty black hat, narrowed with quiet fire. The silent rancher had heard enough. Martha Collins had lost her husband a year earlier in a mining accident that left her alone with her only boy, Samuel. The town knew her as a hard-working woman, sewing clothes for ranch hands and washing linens for the hotel to scrape together a living. But survival was cruel on the frontier, and debts had a way of growing faster than crops. She had fallen behind on her payments to the land baron, Judge Halbert, a man feared more for his influence than admired for his fairness. And Judge Halbert had come to collect, in the most unthinkable way. 2 of his hired guns stood at Martha's doorway that morning, cold eyes and colder voices. "The boys serve in the judge's household," one said, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "You can't pay, so he'll work it off." Samuel clung to his mother, his face buried in her skirts, trembling like a leaf. The townsfolk gathered, some curious, some pitying, but none daring to interfere. No one challenged Judge Halbert. No one ever did, until that moment. The silent rancher, known only as Boone to those few who bothered to speak his name, stepped forward from the shadow of the saloon. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the kind of stillness that made even seasoned gunmen uneasy. Boone was a man who spoke rarely, but when he did, people listened. Rumor had it he had once been a lawman, a gunfighter, maybe even worse, but no one knew for sure. All they knew was that Boone carried scars he didn't show in silence that cut deeper than most men's words. He didn't speak at first. He just moved closer, boots crunching against the dry earth, until he stood between the widow and the hired guns. One of them shifted uneasily, spitting into the dirt. "Best keep walkin', stranger. Ain't your fight." Boone's eyes flickered toward the boy. Samuel's tear-stained face met his, wide with fear, and in that fleeting moment something passed between them. Something the rancher had thought long buried. He spoke at last, his voice low, rough like gravel dragged across steel. "The boy stays with his mother." A tense silence fell over the crowd. Nobody defied Judge Halbert, nobody. The hired gun smirked, tapping his revolver. "Judge says otherwise. You fixin' to argue with the law?" Boone tilted his head slightly, his hand resting near his own holster, though he hadn't drawn. His eyes, steady and unblinking, pinned the man in place. "That ain't law," he said slowly. "That's theft." Whispers broke out among the onlookers, the kind of whispers that made powerful men nervous. Judge Halbert himself emerged from his carriage then, his broad frame dressed in fine clothes that gleamed against the dusty street. His face bore the smugness of unchecked authority. "Boone," he drawled, "I should have known you'd stick your nose where it doesn't belong. This woman owes me. Her land, her wages, everything. And debts must be paid." Boone's jaw tightened. He took a step closer. "Not with a child," Halbert sneered. "You gonna pay for her then? You ain't got enough cattle to cover her debt. You think your reputation scares me? You're just another broken gun hand hiding in silence." The crowd waited, breathless, expecting Boone to walk away. But instead, the rancher removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair, and spoke words that stunned everyone. "I'll take her debt." Gasps rippled through the street. Martha's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing in her eyes. Halbert's smile faded. "You can't be serious." Boone's gaze was like stone. "Write it down. Her land stays hers. The boy stays hers. Her debt's mine now." Halbert studied him for a long moment, weighing whether Boone's challenge was worth the risk. Finally, with a shrug, he signaled his men to back down. "Fine," he said smoothly, though his eyes glinted with malice. "But remember this, Boone. You just bought yourself a fight you can't win." The guns holstered, the carriage rolled away, and the crowd slowly dispersed. Martha collapsed to her knees, clutching Samuel, whispering thanks through her sobs. Boone knelt down, resting a calloused hand on the boy's shoulder. He said nothing more, but in his silence was a promise stronger than any words. But the frontier had a way of twisting promises into bloodshed. Over the following days, Boone worked his ranch harder than ever, selling cattle, trading horses, stretching every dollar to cover Martha's debt. The townsfolk began to talk, not just of his defiance, but of the way he kept an eye on the widow's home, the way Samuel followed him around like a shadow. Some said Boone was looking for redemption. Others said he was courting trouble. And trouble came. One night, as the sun bled into the horizon, Boone's ranch was set aflame. He and his men barely managed to save half the herd before the fire devoured the rest. Tracks in the dirt told him what he already knew. It was Halbert's doing. The next morning, a note was nailed to Martha's door. It read, "The boy, or your lives." Martha trembled as she read it, clutching Samuel to her chest. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. Boone stood silent, staring at the message. His eyes darkened with something dangerous. He turned slowly to Martha, his voice low but certain. "We fight." That night, Boone prepared. He cleaned his revolver, sharpened his knife, and saddled his horse. But as he worked, Samuel crept into the barn, his small hands trembling as he held out a wooden toy gun Boone had whittled for him days earlier. "Will you come back?" the boy asked. Boone crouched, taking the toy from him gently. "I'll come back," he said, the words heavy with truth. "But you stay with your mama. No matter what." The moon hung high when Boone rode into town. The saloon lamps burned bright, and Halbert's men were already waiting, rifles slung, smirks on their faces. Boone dismounted, his boots echoing across the boards as he stepped into the street. Halbert appeared, his voice thick with arrogance. "You should have stayed quiet, Boone. Now you'll die for a woman and her brat." Boone's hand hovered near his holster. His silence was more terrifying than a war cry. The first shot rang out, tearing through the night. But it wasn't Boone who fell. His revolver was a blur of steel, his aim cold and precise. One man dropped, then another, until the street was chaos, shouts, gunfire, smoke thick in the air. Boone moved like a shadow, every shot finding its mark. When the smoke cleared, only Halbert remained, cowering behind a barrel, his fine clothes spattered with dirt and fear. Boone walked toward him, revolver steady. Halbert raised his hands, stammering, "Wait, we can settle this." But Boone's silence said more than mercy ever could. The next morning, the town awoke to find Judge Halbert's reign ended. His estate was abandoned, his men scattered or dead. And at the edge of the street, Martha and Samuel stood, watching Boone ride back to his ranch, weary but unbroken. The widow's eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved us," she whispered. Boone tipped his hat, his voice carrying like a vow. "No, you saved me." From that day on, Boone wasn't just the silent rancher. He was the man who had stood between a widow and the darkness of the frontier, the man who gave hope where there was none. And though the plains would always be harsh, and the wind would always howl with sorrow, one small family knew they were no longer alone. And in the silence Boone carried, there was peace.